I am Maria Bergstrom, and I'm really delighted to welcome to Michigan Tech our keynote speaker for the Essential Ed Symposium. Shane Sutherland is the founder and CEO of PebblePad, that's our ePortfolio platform. And 2 weeks ago, he promoted himself to Chief Academic Officer. And he also, so he said, is often referred to, I think maybe he refers to himself as the Chief Mischief Maker at PebblePad. He has had a diverse learning career, which evolved into a varied teaching career, ultimately working as principal lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, leading projects concerned with enhancing learning. Shane introduced PebblePad to the university in 2004 and spent 3 years as the portfolio coordinator, and has spoken at more than 30 international conferences and is always willing to share the ideas that have shaped PebblePad. And he says sometimes this gets him in trouble. This is a good crowd to get in trouble with. Drawing upon his learning and teaching background and guided by the constant engagement with the PebblePad community and the wider portfolio community, Shane remains as passionate as ever about the evolving development of learner and learning-centric teaching and assessment. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Shane, and I want to give you a warm Michigan Tech welcome. Thank you.
Wow. Sounds quite a twit, that fella she just read out about. It's really funny having your bio read out, because some of it now feels so ancient that I don't kind of recognize it. And it's also spooky. How do people find this stuff out about you? Because normally when people introduce me, it's just, here's Shane. And that's good enough for me. It's fascinating actually hearing all of that, because I read something yesterday, which I'll refer to in a moment, which it's the World Economic Forum, who talked about people now having up to 7 careers. So not 7 jobs, but 7 careers. And it's funny because even at my age, which is now quite advanced, I had 18 jobs before I became a fireman. Because every time someone wouldn't let me go sailing or hiking, I would leave a job and move on. So I had a whole pile of jobs, including cleaning the poo off tractors at one point in the winter, and that wasn't a great job. And then I became a fireman, and then I got into more organised forms of learning, and all the time I was also a sailing instructor, and I got really interested in becoming a better teacher. So I went to my local place of adult learning, which was an old mechanical institute, which I guess will resonate with some of you here. And they taught me on a 12-week course how to be a teacher. And I liked it so much I went and did the year-long course. And I enjoyed that so much I did the 3-year degree. And I liked that so much I did an MA in the School of Education. And then they gave me a job there, which was really weird. And they let me loose with students, and no one ever checked on how good I was as a teacher. And I'm reminded, or was reminded, by something Darnie. Is that right, Darnie? Yeah, you. Dar said in the last session, which was about allowing pauses. Because one of the things that I did when I began teaching at university was I taught like I taught firemen and like I taught sailing. We would do stuff and then we try and make sense of it. And the problem when I became a teacher in the classroom is we just did stuff. And I knew it was fascinating stuff, and I knew there was lots of learning in there, but I tried to cram so much stuff in that my students went off to the next lessons not realizing they'd learned stuff. So my biggest learning lesson in a way when I started teaching was the pause thing. The stopping to make sense, the pausing to let things sink in. But of course, just pausing isn't enough. I think you need a framework, you need some questions that help you think, that help you interrogate what you've experienced. And I mentioned I've taken me off track from what I actually planned to talk about. Although I've been twiddling with my presentation as the day's gone on, because what's been fascinating is everything I plan to say, I've already heard in the session from Melissa and Travis and Liz, and from Dar and Laura and Chris, and from you, Maria, and Kelly. So this is kind of, if you've been to all the same sessions as me, this is a reprise in some respects. We've already done the rehearsal. So I was asked to talk about ePortfolios around the world. I was asked to not make it a sales pitch. Well, I kind of don't have to make it a sales pitch because you've already bought PebblePad. Thank you. Where's Claire? Claire was here somewhere earlier. It was part of the decision making. It's hard for me to separate out portfolios and PebblePad because they've been my life for 21 years and they're closely entwined. But I will try not sell you the platform, but to sell you the ideas behind the platform and how people are using it. And real examples from around the world. Talking of around the world, I was thinking, what kind of connections can I make to being here? What I know is a really prestigious institution. And I had a fantastic tour yesterday with Nancy, all around the peninsula, finding out all about the mining and the lumber, the forestry work. And I thought, what connections have I got with that? And then I realised, in fact, does anyone know what this is at all? And I know it's not all engineers here. Yeah, who said that? It's the Iron Bridge. It's just down the road from our offices. It was the world's first iron bridge. It's in a World Heritage Site it's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. And it's funny because when I've been chatting to folks here, I say I live in a very rural county, which is really rural, Shropshire in England. But it was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, where they learned to turn coal into coke, and that allowed them to heat iron up to much higher temperatures, and then they started making everything out of iron. So that's where I'm from. And I'm going to make some links back to that as we go through the chat. And maybe there's a story here, because we heard about storytelling in the last session as well. And I hope, because this all makes sense in my head, I hope this ultimately all makes sense in your heads as well. So we call ourselves, or recently have called ourselves, the ePortfolio for Higher Education. And I've resisted being an ePortfolio for 21 years because ePortfolios for me are those things that come out of a process. They're the stories that students tell, the kind of digital resumes, but also more than that, there can be any form of story that explains a thing I've done or a thing I've become or who I've become. So ePortfolios, I think, allow you to show the world that you are awesome. PebblePad, this is part of a pitch, I realise, makes you or helps you become awesome. And by awesome, because awesome's an interesting word to use, isn't it? We're talking about career ready, world ready, future ready. Does anybody know what a swarm artist is? I've been asking this question for a long time, and I did this once, and someone put their hand up and said, my son's a swarm artist. And a swarm artist is one of those people who does the great big drone light shows. And her son had gone to university to do business studies and had left university and become a drone artist, a drone pilot. And that was the thing that didn't even exist when he went to university. And that's the thing now, isn't it? The reason there are so many careers is because careers keep on just popping out of nowhere. All this stuff around AI, for example. I noticed one of your essential skills is communicate quantitatively. I mean, that whole thing around data and telling stories through data is really a fairly recent emergent field. So who knows what the future holds for us? And I think that's why things like the essential abilities are so important, because they fit students for careers which don't even yet exist. And they fit them for things beyond their careers so they are successful in their future lives. And we think we do that by scaffolding. That's another word I've been hearing today, which is great. Supporting and surfacing learning, making learning visible. So to the careers folks who are here, you'll know there's often concern around what's called the skills articulation gap, that you are probably doing marvellous things in the classroom with your students, but when they sit in front of employers and employers ask them what they can do, they're often unable to articulate the skills they have because they didn't pause enough to make sense of it. They didn't practice speaking to those skills in lots of different ways. And for me, that's not just about, this is a problem with ePortfolios, not just at the end of the journey, not writing a portfolio to say, hey world, look how awesome I am. It's about using them all the way through the journey, so you have plenty of opportunities to rehearse and practice and come to understand who you are, and to then speak confidently and expansively to your skills and ambitions. Excuse me while I have a bit of whiskey. Do you have whiskey up here? As in, not can I buy it, do you make whiskey up here? I might have to take some home with me. So that whole thing about scaffolding and supporting, most portfolio platforms, of course, do this bit. The collecting, the curating, the sharing and showcasing. And again, we just did a thing about the reflecting in action and reflecting on action. There's a really, really important piece before that, I think, which is reflecting before action, preflection, pre-mortems, making it fail, all of those kinds of things. Leveling questions of what's likely to happen. Because if you do that, you're more likely to be successful. The number of conversations I have with students where, I'm jumping ahead in my presentation, but I'll do it now anyway, where universities provide students with fantastic experiences, and then students find themselves in those experiences, not quite sure why they're there, what's expected of them, what success looks like. And so the value of those experiences, which are often very expensive in all sorts of ways to provide, the real value of them is lost because students weren't fully prepared to make the most of them. So for me, the planning and preparing part is really, really important. And then the recording and reflecting. But they're not easy things to do. Hence the idea of the scaffolding and the supporting of learning. And again, I'm just name checking the folks I've been in sessions with. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the sessions. But the session this morning on with Melissa again and Travis and Liz was based on questions. It was all about the kind of questions to talk to use with your students when advising them, guiding them, coaching them. And I think for me, really the purpose of higher education is not to learn stuff, but to learn a whole pile of questions that you can level at stuff. The more sophisticated your questions, the broader the repertoire of questions you have, the better a learner you become, I think. So there's a session that I missed by Nancy where she talked about easy things to do with students and to get value out of the portfolio, and harder things to do. And I think what I'm going to do as I go through the presentation is show you some examples of really easy things and some examples of more complex things, but complex things which I think really add significant value to student learning and student success. By the way, is my version of English okay? Yeah. Just checking. I have to keep writing words down that I'm learning from you lot as well. Okay. So where do we go from here? I think when we designed PebblePad, it was a reaction, a rejection of work we were doing at the University of Wolverhampton, which was about digitizing content and broadcasting it at scale. And we're still doing it like 20, 25 years later. It was about trying to support students through these questions that help them interrogate their own learning and experience. And in PebblePad, we have two ways of doing this. We have the highly structured, highly scaffolded, but less creative. And then we have the much more creative storytelling side of the system in the pages and the portfolios. Why PebblePad? Why now? I mean, I'm touching on it already. Universities used to be the place you went to get that curated, highly valuable knowledge that wasn't really accessible anywhere else. And to be fair, and this is still the case, people that helped you make sense of it. But now content is everywhere, and there are experts across the web a click away that can help you make sense of really complex physics and chemistry and a whole variety of things which once upon a time were only accessible to you at university. So learning is moving away from content and much more towards experience, towards the development of essential abilities that do make you future ready, career ready, world ready. But as I mentioned, experience just on its own is not enough to lead to learning. Schoen talked about this, Dewey talked about this. You have to really pay attention to it. You have to level questions at experience. And for me, it's a small but powerful statement, that habit of noticing. Again, Danny, sorry. I'm going to practice your dance as well later on. I like the idea of dancing in class. Why did I just name check you then? I'm slightly jet lagged as well, so if my sentences aren't entirely coherent, that's what it is. The habit of noticing is really, really important. Seeing things that are happening, making sense of them, making learning visible, and not just visible to others for forms of assessment, feedback, and grading, but visible to self. So you understand what you've achieved, what you're capable of, and I think importantly as well, understanding the gaps in your learning, so you become a self-regulating, self-directed learner. You can start to plug those gaps yourself. And there's a huge movement in Australia around career self-management, and not just getting the job you want, but understanding yourself and the skills you have and how they fit to a future career, and taking charge of how you plug the gaps and how you celebrate, by the way, also the things that are strengths for you. So this habit of noticing, I think, is super important, making learning visible. I did this about 4 o'clock this morning. I know what it was. It was because that thing about knowledge. In a way, this was a bit of a hallucinatory kind of dream. It was somehow that sense that when you learned facts, you kind of would have learned, I guess, that wooden bridges were superseded by stone bridges, were superseded by metal bridges, and there's kind of one. And then somebody, I guess, this was at Eagle River. Somebody said, wait a minute, why are we following this kind of logic? Because maybe there's things that concrete does really, really well, like form the base of these things. And metal, because of its various properties, is fantastic for joints. But the sort of strength, particularly of laminated wood, is... So I just thought it was a fantastic, example of someone who was curious and didn't accept extant knowledge or understanding and just challenged it a bit, and came up with a beautiful bridge that now sits at Eagle River. I'm kind of out of my depth talking about anything engineering related or sciencey, but it struck me that, you need to have the right, again, I'll repeat myself continually, being curious, having questions to level at the things that are held to be true, challenging them, challenging the orthodoxy, and from that being innovative and creative and developing new learning, and testing out learning in practice all the time as well. Lots of this has come to me over the last kind of few days. This was just appeared on LinkedIn yesterday, and I thought it was fascinating as well. I talked about there's multiple careers. Once upon a time, and I think this was the case when I didn't go to university until I was 30, because my path was kind of set for me. You became a manual worker, and you might have got promoted in that job. And your particular skill set only allowed you to follow a particular path. But now I think there are so many opportunities. So we talked about those 7 careers, multiple jobs, careers which don't even exist right now. What you'll be doing with your students through this Essential Ed program is developing in them, alongside kind of confidence and awareness, all of those skills which will allow them to choose any of those paths they see fit. Now, there has to be some fundamental foundational knowledge for the disciplines. I couldn't suddenly start practicing as a physician. In fact, I couldn't practice as many things. But understanding the gaps between where you are now and where you want to be, and what possible routes there are to get there, and how you get the learning and the certifications, how you leverage relationships and contacts, all of that stuff is how we thrive in the modern world. And the skills that you'll develop through the Essential Ed are the skills which allow your students to have multiple choices through their many careers. So this is the bit where I start to get into the examples of how people use the platform, because part of the idea of this session, and I think part of the reason I was invited, was just to offer up some opportunities, some ideas to incite some interest and curiosity in you as to how many of these things could possibly work with the students that you teach. So we know about portfolios. This is an individual portfolio. I'm not sure if you know that you can collaborate in PebblePad and create collaborative portfolios. So it's a little project. So it's portfolios for me really are stories. It's just a story about a project that two people undertook to, I think this was post-COVID, to turn a miserable balcony in their offices into a garden space. And you can see, I always get a bit embarrassed about when I talk about PebblePad, because we can't compete with Wix, Weebly, WordPress, or anything which is a website builder. We are part of a learning platform. The portfolios are part of a learning platform. You can make connections across all of the assets in the system. And yet, every time I worry about the fact we can't compete with Wix, Weebly, or WordPress, I look at portfolios like this that really clever students have put together, and I'm amazed and really proud, actually. I love this portfolio. It's from Susan Bonham from Langara University. I partly put this on because I'm so jealous of the fact she went on a kayaking placement or experiential learning thing, kayaking around Mexico, learning about experiential pedagogy. And she put it all together into her multi-page portfolio. And you can see the side navigation there gives you some sense of how much she's written about. And this became then a resource which she shares with her colleagues, so they get to learn from the experience that she had. And if you spoke to Susan, she will tell you how much more she learned putting together the portfolio. So she had the experience, she made notes as she went along and took photos and learned lots of stuff, and then went back to it and wrote a portfolio. And at the second time of writing, I suppose, she had to revisit all of those things. It helped her organize them in her mind differently, to put them into chapters and pages, and that itself was a learning experience. I like this one because it's from Jahira, and it's the chapter, if you like, that I've expanded is her capstone portfolio. So she did a capstone portfolio at university, and she's so proud of what she did, because it wasn't just busy work, it was meaningful work, that she then made her own portfolio talking about herself as a professional and embedded her capstone portfolio within it. And I think that's a great testament, isn't it, to the design of the work she did at university, that she was so proud of it. She wanted to share it with others as part of her personal creation. It's really difficult showing you lots of examples, because we need to have a very tall, long screen when you're taking screenshots. And I put this one on because I know you do you've got a strong arts program here. This is from the Wilson School of Design. I've seen great examples from the Queensland College of Art, where the students use the portfolios as kind of digital sketchbooks. So they just capture all sorts of bits of evidence, images, videos, quotes, phrases, and some of these pages are really long, and through them you can see ideas forming, and it's just a place to collect things together. It doesn't sort of tell a story in its own right. The storytelling then comes right at the end, where some sense is made of it. And I think that's very similar in some respects to learning journals. where sometimes when students go on placements or study abroad or community projects, week by week, things don't kind of make sense necessarily. Things only make sense sometimes looking back at them. I remember hearing a story from a student who had done a teaching placement in Malawi, and she kept her learning journal every week of the things she was learning. And she told us that she thought she had learned a particular thing until she went back and read through all of her learning journals and realized there was this more powerful thread. And the powerful thread she talked about was community and how the community really supported each other. But it was really odd that as the weeks went by, she was reinforcing this idea that a particular theme was important, and only through retrospectively reading. And I think there's a phrase I quite like, because it's a word most people aren't familiar with, diachronicity. And diachronicity explains the idea that when you look back on a thing from where you are now, you can only understand it from who you are now and all the things you've learned. But if you keep a journal all the way through, it reminds you of how you thought at different stages of your development. And that really helps you make sense of. And I've heard this term used already a couple of times today, of the journey you have been on and who you have become or are becoming. And that's really important. And I think that's also really important nowadays when students, not just students, parents, employers, the government, of whatever shape the government is, are challenging the value of university education. When I talk to, and I'm fortunate to talk to many senior leaders in universities, a common thread across all of the territories we operate in is that there's a challenge to the value of higher education. And we all have to do something to help all of our stakeholders really understand that it's much more than just content acquisition and kind of testing. It's about all of the forms of learning that take place through this experience. And we have to help make that visible, I think, to students and to others. So we talked about portfolios, which are sort of free form. We use templates quite a lot in PebblePad. So we've talked about reflection. The problem with reflection is it's complicated. If you say to a student, go and reflect on a thing, and they have a blank sheet of paper, it's really, really hard to get started. And often what happens is they describe things which happened. They don't then sort of dig into and interrogate those things. So using templates can really help. In fact, there's nothing better than sitting down with somebody, if you have the opportunity, and a person who's well versed in questioning, a mentor, a coach, an advisor, can ask you lots of questions. But the problem is that's really difficult to scale up. It's really difficult to make it available to every student wherever they happen to be at any point in time. So templates for me act as a proxy for conversations with experienced and knowledgeable others. And of course, you don't have to just use the templates that are in the box. You can build your own. And just some examples here. The first one's I know these are really impossible to read at this scale. The first one's an essay plan. Lots of concerns about students cheating. I think students often cheat because they get to the 11th hour and they just didn't know how to get started. So a few questions which help give them the steps to help them start warming up. And importantly, from an assessment, and when I use assessment, I mean the observation of sort of student learning to give them feedback. From an assessment point of view, it makes the process visible. We've become so used in higher education to assessing the products of learning and then doing some guesswork about how students arrived at that product. Well, if you make the process visible, you can provide really, really valuable feedback on that. You can give credit for that. That's where all the learning is happening. Sometimes the product doesn't show all of that. I like the middle one because it's a flight simulations thing. So imagine how expensive it is putting on flight simulations in a university. So the students take the flight recording, pop it in the little holder there, and interrogate it. And that was, again, a thing I saw on one of the sessions earlier, watching recordings of performance, whether you're an athlete, a performer, a trainee pilot, watching the recordings and say, I I should have done better there. Recognizing your own levels of achievement, understanding what good looks like, recognizing that and understanding also how to improve your own performance. And then the other one is just a project proposal. Just think through what it is exactly you're going to do. And you can take those templates, oh my goodness, already, and you can stitch them together into what we call workbooks. And this is just a series of learning logs. I talked about logs and journals. And PebblePads are just the vehicle, I want to say that. The brilliance comes from faculty, staff, learning designers who design the questions, who understand the journey they want to take their students on. So think of the project you worked on this week. What did you do that was unsuccessful? Why was it unsuccessful? What are you going to do next week? And then taking all of those journals and looking back at them from an end of term summary here. And again, not just a blank sheet of paper, but something which says, what did you learn? Think about particularly those first few weeks that you're recording. Who are you now compared to who you were back then? And again, the language, I think, is wonderful. You're asking for magnificent failures. And how much more inviting is it to ask for magnificent failures than to say what went wrong? That's from internship at the University of Waterloo. At the University of Edinburgh do these things called student-led individually created courses. It's a way of scaling up undergraduate research. And they use them in so many different ways now. But essentially all they are is a project framework that says, what's the thing you want to do? In fact, what they do there, which is wonderful, is they say, here are 5 outcomes you have to meet. Now think about those outcomes and think about the project you have in mind. And these projects have been micro-entrepreneurship, setting up small businesses, ecological projects in the Amazon rainforest, internships for American senators, all vast range of things. So think of those, your project, think of those 5 outcomes, and rewrite those outcomes in the context of your, doing 5 again, in the context of your project. What does success look like? How would someone measure your success? So we're asking students to interrogate what's expected of them, to write it in their own language to make sure they understand it, and to state their own levels of performance that they can work towards. And they've been highly successful using a range of universities now. But just a project plan. And what happens as well, by the way, with these, it allows you to scale up research without having the additional supervisory burden, because often the supervisory bit is just making sure that people are going through all the right sort of stages, and you use that very precious supervisory time, I guess, to help with the more difficult. It's like a form of flipped classroom, isn't it? Helping with the more complex parts of the projects. This is a nice example from Griffith University where they're doing in physics, chemistry, in fact across the STEM programs. This is to help students do lab experiments. And the first few tabs are around lab design, equipment setup, data science, and then you pop in the findings as you go through the experiment. And I think what's fascinating about this is that talking to some folks at the University of Sydney, they found that students used to do experiments and know what the outcome was meant to be. And if the experiment was going slightly wrong, they knew what they were supposed to be showing, so they would, I'm going to use that cheat word, they would manipulate things to get to the result they knew was expected. And all of a sudden, because the whole process is made visible, they've got evidence, digital evidence they're showing in the workbook, and now they have to try to understand why they haven't arrived at the results that were expected. That's super valuable learning, isn't it? Trying to understand, was it something with the equipment set up, the chemicals that were in use, whatever it may be. So it's actually helped improve the quality of the lab work because it's more visible, authentic. And of course, if you're creating, because I think these lab experiment workbooks become little booklets. So I picture these as a shelf, and every time you do a lab experiment, you've got a little portfolio that's explaining everything that happened. And then you can go, if someone says to you, can you demonstrate or tell me a time when something did go wrong and you learned from it and what you did to correct that? Oh yeah, I've got this little chapter here I can show you. But you can also take those and add them as evidence to a framework of skills. And so for so many professional programs, there will be these frameworks that exist. And you can go and add evidence and you can rate your development over time. If you were doing engineering, because what happens on this one is you go to the framework and you say, I'm claiming to be a 5 on that, I better put some evidence against it. On this one, you have an experience first, and both work hand in hand, by the way. You can come at it from either direction. And you do something, and then you say, that thing there would be great evidence. So on one of the sessions, where's Ken? Is Ken still here? I was in a session with Ken and James and Amber and Alden, earlier. And we were talking about just the value of signalling. So the session, it was Maria and Kelly's session, and it was how do you help sort of your students understand the relationship from to the minor, from the course that you're teaching. Well, so much of this is just signalling. If you're teaching a thing, you don't even have to know anything about PebblePad. If there was a framework of skills that followed the students around, you just have to say, hey, this thing we've just done here was problem solving, or it was creativity, or it was innovation, or it was entrepreneurship, or what. Maybe you might want to write that up or use this as evidence against your skills framework. And so here we're adding a thing we've done, might be a reflection, against a skill on a framework. But actually what you could do is say, well, I'm not just training to be an engineer, I'm training to be a graduate of the future, or a learner of the future. So I've got here my graduate attributes, because this is an example I use all over the place, but that could be my essential abilities. And in fact, so you see here I've got 2 separate frameworks. I'm adding those other skills in. I want to get to this because, again, Melissa, Liz and Travis showed this earlier on. The NACE competencies mapped like spaghetti to the essential abilities. And I think it's really, really powerful, a powerful form of learning to do a thing, to make sense of a thing, and then to say, this thing is probably problem solving. And so I'm going to hang it onto this framework as problem solving. But wait a minute, in this other framework, there's not problem solving, but there is creativity. Is this close enough to creativity? Because our different stories resonate with different audiences who understand different forms of language. The more ways I can find to describe a thing and to validate the claim I'm making, the more powerful my presence and my articulation is going to be in front of employers or accreditors. So thank you for putting that slide up earlier on, it really helped me. I think geology, is geology a thing up here? So, I mean, this obviously isn't geology. This is from paramedicine. But we've got an app, which means you can go out. We've had students in the Kosciuszko mountain range up at the, what's it called? There's a beautifully named schism up in Scotland. But anyway, you can be out miles away with no. In fact, Nancy, we were miles from any signal yesterday up in the top of the upper peninsula. And using the app to record things you've seen, make reflections, and it synchronises when you get back. We have lots of nurses and other health professionals use. I'm starting to talk quickly. In hospital where they just can't get access to a computer. So the app is a great way to just capture, if you like, micro reflections while you're out and about, or bits of video or images or even sound bites. I think this is me coming towards the end. I want to start to really push at the potential for the platform that you have, thank you very much, licensed. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it because it means I get to come here and visit you all in the Upper Peninsula. UP. So this is one of those workbooks, really just a series of templates stitched together. But this particular one is around career self-management. This is one page from that workbook, and it's on networking. And what it has is a combination of real experience, having gone to workshops or gone to events, and content as a proxy for experience. So watch this video, what were the 5 lessons that Sheldon talked about in his networking thing? And how would you do that? What would this mean to you? How confident do you feel about that? What evidence do you have of this particular thing? There's a lovely section on this page somewhere which says, imagine you went to an event like this, and the after drink, there is an after drinks reception, is there? Maybe not. But at the imagined after drinks reception, we're wandering around, and it asks questions like, how do you introduce yourself into a conversation? How do you move on gracefully? And this is that kind of pre-planning bit I talked about, people thinking in advance, well, how would I do that? And here's some little techniques I might use. And it's wonderful in the way it, for me, as a kind of portfolio, as a structured portfolio, it's a portfolio for learning. It's been specifically designed. It's not, and I could get in trouble for this, it's taking some content out of the LMS. And I think the LMS typically is always the best place for content. But while it's very personal about my own development, here it will live with the student forever. They can come back to it time and time again and enhance it, enrich it with further commentary and examples and evidence, and they can share it with others. But it's a portfolio designed for learning. As you work through it, you learn stuff. An example, it's a portfolio as learning. It's evolving. It's accessible anywhere you want to use it. And ultimately, if someone asks me for evidence of my ability to network, it becomes a portfolio of learning. It demonstrates what I'm capable of because it's been enriched by me and all of that evidence and commentary I've added. So we go from the kind of simple but sometimes beautiful portfolios which tell very idiosyncratic stories of me or things that I've done. And I think that's a really important distinction as well. Portfolios don't just have to be about me. They can be my stories of experiences, endeavours, projects. Then we have the simple templates that just do some of the questioning. Tell me more about that. And what did you find particularly difficult? What skills did you bring to bear on this? What skills did you find, or what skills would you like to have had which would have made accomplishing this easier? So that's what the templates do. And ultimately you can start to stitch the templates together into really complex learning portfolios. The town I live in is called Telford, and it's named after an engineer. And I know again, the audience isn't wholly made up of engineers, but given the institution we're in, a brilliant man, started off as a humble stonemason, and this is Pontysolt Aqueduct. Linda, I bet you've been there. Yeah? An iron aqueduct in the sky. And I put this in right at the end because the main theme of my talk was meant to be reflection. And I thought reflection, and this is an emergent idea. In fact, probably lots of clever people have already had this idea, that reflection is like the bridges, isn't it, that connect the learning in the classroom, connect what we did with this week's lesson to last week's and the weeks before, connect the learning we're doing to things we're experiencing outside the classroom in the extra and the co-curricular and in my volunteering and my part-time work. So I think reflection is, sometimes it's a word that's just sort of bandied around, like it's a super simple thing. It's not, it's a real powerful thing. It's brilliant that it stands out in your essential abilities. It's a 21st century skill. And I don't think, reflection is just about, as often portfolio proponents think, is about how you feel about a thing. For me, reflection is much more expansive than that. It's about, as I said, this broad repertoire of questions that grows as you mature as a learner, that allow you to interrogate your experience, in fact, allow you to prepare for experience, to gain the most from it, to recognise things happening on the fly in it, and afterwards to wring the very most amount of value from it. So that's it from me. Thank you for bringing me all the way up here. Yesterday the weather was magnificent, by the way. I have left behind the hottest April in 7 years in the UK. Today looks wonderful, so I really appreciate you getting me up here. Thank you.